Good afternoon and welcome to this introduction to HS2 Archaeology, Fradley to Crewe. Before we begin, I just wanted to share some technical information with you. All lines are muted, so you don't have to worry about any background noise. We don't anticipate any technical issues during our event. However, we wanted to provide you with some advice should you experience any connection issues. If your feed freezes, wait for about 10 seconds as it will most likely correct itself. If this doesn't happen, use the leave button to exit the call and rejoin using the event link. You'll be able to use the toggle at the bottom of your screen to rewind back to where you left the call. You can also use this functionality at any point during the call should you need to pause for any reason. If there is a freeze or you disconnect or you are unable to rejoin due to a wider Microsoft incident, we will email you with further information. There is also a Q&A and comment function which you should be able to find at the top right of your screen. A recording of this live event will also be published on our HS2 YouTube after the event. Therefore, if all else fails, you will be able to replay the event live in your own time. I will now hand over to Chris Jordan for your talk this afternoon.
Good afternoon. My name is Chris Jordan. Thank you so much for dialing into this event, and I hope you're all well at this difficult time. I'm the Historic Environment Manager for Phase 2A of High Speed 2, and that title, Historic Environment Manager, means I have three areas of responsibility. I'm responsible for the archaeology, which we're going to talk about today, which is the below ground evidence that we're going to be uncovering. I'm responsible for built heritage, the historic buildings that HS2 might affect. And I'm responsible for the historic landscape, the traces of the past landscapes that we move through. And I apply those responsibilities to the area between Fradley and Crewe, which is the 2A section of HS2. So today we're going to be talking about this 2A section. There's been some previous open day sessions, some really good ones from some of my colleagues on the great archaeology that's being found on Phase 1 of High Speed 2. But today we're going to be talking about a little bit of an earlier stage. Phase 2A of High Speed 2 is at an earlier stage. It's not quite at that construction excavation stage. We're going to be talking about the planning and the early stages and some of the early survey work we've done. This is going to be more of an introductory session than some of the other Heritage Open Day sessions you might have attended, because we're really keen to bring you along a journey from the very beginning of this process. We want to engage with communities along the HS2 route, along the 2A route, and we want to really bring you along over the next few years as we start this work, as we plan this work, as we begin this work, as we start to find those amazing discoveries, and as we move through to the excavation and the publication and get them to the museums and really share those stories. So today's going to be about the future. We're going to be talking a little bit about how we plan, about why we do archaeology, about why we propose a programme of archaeology and heritage work along this 2A route. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we want to find out. We obviously have a process that we want to go through in order to make sure that we really understand what we're looking for, to make sure that we get the best value for money for the taxpayer, to really plan and program our works to deliver them efficiently and effectively, to get the very best archaeology and make sure that we can disseminate and share this information as widely as possible. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing along the 2A route so far, these very early stages of work, where we'll be targeting work in the future, the techniques that we're going to use so that those of you that live in the area, and I hope there's a few of you on the call now that live in the area, will know what to expect, to know what you'll see in the fields and the landscape in Staffordshire and Cheshire, and to know the archaeological work and to understand and to be informed about the archaeology that we're expecting or we're going to find. So if we move on to the next slide, let's just talk a little bit about the context of High Speed 2 Phase 2A. High Speed 2 itself is the new high speed backbone of the rail line that's going to connect the cities of London and Birmingham in Phase 1, and particularly relevant for our discussion today, up to Crewe. Today we're going to talk about the element. There's a lot of blue on this map, but we're going to talk about the element in mid blue. You can kind of see that in the middle of the screen next to the label that says Stafford. To the right of that label there's a slightly darker blue. That dark blue runs between Fradley, sort of in the Lichfield area, and up to Crewe itself. Phase 1 of High Speed 2 is in the darker colour there. That's in the southern area, that's London, Euston, all the way up to Birmingham New Street, and then a little bit further north towards Lichfield. As I said, those guys are in construction at the moment. They're a little bit more advanced, and We're at the planning stage now in that mid-blue area, and we're hoping with consent to begin our archaeological programme in 2021. And we're looking for the works in this area, so on that middle blue colour, to extend roughly about the next 5 years. So I'm expecting there'll be plenty of updates that we can bring to the next few Heritage Open Days. So that's the kind of the national context of where we're at. But it's important, to understand what sits behind this map, and to understand that when we look at that, a simple line on a map actually represents a vast scale of archaeological undertaking covering parts of 2 counties, Staffordshire and East Cheshire. And that kind of landscape scale is certainly something that's recognised by our colleagues at Historic England. And on the next slide, we can see a quote from Duncan Wilson, the CEO of Historic England. And I think it's worth reading in full because it really articulates the scale of what we're trying to achieve. HS2 is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to improve our understanding of how people have shaped England's landscapes over thousands of years. That's really critical to how we work, and it's really critical to how we work on 2A in particular. The 2A phase is only 57 kilometres long, and I use only in sort of air quotes almost, because that's kind of the little brother of Phase 1. But by any other standard, this section between Fradley and Crewe, this 57 kilometres, would be one of the largest and most complex archaeological projects that's ever been undertaken. But it forms part of that greater whole. It forms part of a consistent archaeological project stretching from Euston to Crewe. And that kind of allows us the consistent approach to understand, for example, prehistoric sites outside the M25, prehistoric sites outside Lichfield, both of which we've recorded already, and the prehistoric sites we're anticipating near Crewe. And these will all be excavated to the same standards and delivered by the same teams. And that really gives us that kind of consistency, that ability to understand how people have changed and shaped the landscape of this part of England over thousands of years. And it's the shape of that 57 kilometres of this stretch of land that's so important and interesting for us as well. When we think about archaeology in the UK, we need to think not only about sort of how we think about Time Team and how we think about academia. It's not just about the great work that academia does, but it's a lot of archaeological work is professional work that's done in advance of housing and other development projects. Since 1990, archaeology has been a requirement of planning permission, and that applies to nuclear power plants, it applies to small conservatory extensions, and of course it applies to high-speed rail lines. So whenever someone needs to get that planning permission, they need to make sure they've carried out the right archaeological work. But the flip side of that, of course, is that means that a lot of archaeology work is concentrated in areas where people need housing, where those planning permission is required. So it avoids floodplains, it avoids steep slopes, it avoids the kind of deeply rural areas where there's a little less demand for that kind of housing. HS2, and particularly Phase 2A, is going to be very different. Because a railway needs to be relatively straight for obvious reasons, particularly a high-speed line. This means that railway has to cross those floodplains, it has to cross those slopes, and it has to cross those areas that are a little bit less explored by archaeologists. So really the great opportunity here, and the great opportunity that this quote sums up so well, is that our archaeologists will be investigating areas where there hasn't been so much work done previously. North Staffordshire, East Cheshire particularly, are areas where the archaeology is a little less visible, both for those kind of reasons that I've outlined, but also some technical reasons that I'll get into a little bit later. And the archaeology work in this area there's been some great work done, but a little bit less intensely than some of the other areas further to the south. So this quote really sums up 2A in a really positive way. This is a real opportunity to transform our understanding of particularly the landscapes of North Staffordshire and East Cheshire. And as we move on to the next slide, I think it's worth talking about the other key reason that archaeology is so often done. And it's worth talking about another amazing aspect of our Phase 1 programme, which is the incredible public interest which drives so much of what we do. Obviously, as archaeologists, everyone at this company in the archaeology team is very passionate about our work. We're into this business because we want to explore and tell these stories. But what's been amazing is the public interest, the amount of interest around the entire world that has been driven by the HS2 project. We launched our campaign to sort of tell people about archaeology in October 2018, and in the last couple of years it really has provided headlines around the world. On the top right there you can see the headline from the Sydney Morning Herald. This was in relation to the discovery of Captain Matthew Flinders, a Napoleonic ship captain whose remains were uncovered in a site near Euston. This made the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald on Australia Day. What a phenomenal advertisement for the archaeological industry in this country and for archaeology in general. Moving around, we see that the Guardian leads off with the size of the dig. The New York Times, another sort of important world paper, we have there the story about a second individual who might be able to be identified in Euston, Bill Richmond, a famous boxer born in slavery in the United States and came over to the UK to make his career before being usher at the coronation of George IV. So a really fascinating story there. Turning to the bottom right, you can see the most recent issue of Current Archaeology, which brings us bang up to date, and you can see their lead story is about the incredible railway heritage we're uncovering at Curzon Street in Birmingham. And in fact, the background behind me today is an aerial drone shot of some of the incredible roundhouse we found there. This is an interesting and important piece of railway architecture dating from about 1837, and we've identified it as potentially the earliest such piece of railway architecture in the world. This is really important and interesting archaeology that is making headlines around the world, and certainly for the Phase One project, this has culminated in the BBC documentary on our work. If you missed it, it was first shown on Tuesday on BBC Two, but there is an opportunity to catch up on iPlayer, and I would urge you to have a look at that, because it really does show the scale of the works that HS2 are undertaking. And I think the scale of that is particularly important when we talk about that documentary, because it shows the resources and how seriously HS2 takes its responsibilities to deliver archaeology. Archaeology is a profession, it's a construction industry profession, and it's something that we, as a construction project, embrace and that we embed into our work, and that we make sure that we deliver a really high standard of archaeological work. We're very, very keen to keep building on this great work on Phase 2A, and I have no doubt that we'll have similar headlines as we begin the exploration and excavation of archaeological remains on Phase 2A. So that's a little bit of background about Phase 1. That's a little bit of background of where those guys are at. But let's talk about what we're going to be doing on Phase 2A on this area between Lichfield and Crewe, on this area of North Staffordshire and East Cheshire. So when we try to build a railway, whenever we build anything, we need to make commitments to do archaeology, and our commitments are enshrined in something called the Heritage Memorandum. This is a commitment to Parliament that HS2 will do the historic environment work correctly, and crucially, that will deliver a research-led programme of archaeological works. And this research-led programme is really key for us, because it makes sure that as we begin to look into the history of this area of the country, we really want to understand the landscape that we're going to be excavating, that we can tie into those national research questions, the key questions that are driving archaeologists, that are steering the way they work, and that we can really feed into these key drivers and priorities. We want to make sure that we're really driving good practice and getting the best value for the taxpayers' money. So we want this strategy, we want to understand what archaeology we've got, how we can investigate that, and what we can get out of that the public and that you guys, that ourselves, that are interested in. And this is the very first thing that we've been working on most recently on the 2A project. We've held workshops and discussions with local archaeologists in the area. We've consulted with our colleagues at Historic England, who are the sort of government's national heritage organisation. We've consulted with academics across the country, including sort of Oxbridge, and that's led us really to look at three key areas for this strategy. This is the things that have come out of those discussions and those deliberations have created this kind of threefold structure. Firstly, we want to create knowledge. We want to understand, of course, what went on in this past. We want to know what these people that lived in this landscape for the past thousands of years, how they lived, how they moved, how they existed, what impacts and traces they left in the landscape. We want to know about our past, about our shared past, but we also want to improve our current practices. We want to create knowledge about how we do archaeology. We want to set the standard for doing good archaeological work. We've drawn up a series of research questions to grapple with the key history of what makes this area the way it is and how people lived in this area. And I'm going to talk a few about what we're going to try and find out in a second. But the second part of our strategy really is we want to involve people. We want to involve communities and groups along the route, and we want to excite them about their past and engage people in these works. Obviously, COVID has had a significant impact on this, of course it has, but the fact we can talk to you via Teams through this technology, the fact we can hold these kind of open days, I think is a real plus. We can take steps to make sure that we're engaging you from the very beginning. I'm a member of the Chartered Institute of Archaeologists, as are all of my colleagues at HS2, and one of the tenets of our organisation is that we don't own the stories and the work that we excavate, we are obliged to share them, to publish them, to make them available to everybody, because we recognise that these are not our stories, these are not owned by HS2, these are stories that we want to share and spread around. And this forms a very key part of what we're trying to do. Thirdly, we want to leave a legacy. We want to leave a lasting legacy. We know that HS2 is not just a temporary construction programme. We are going to leave, there is going to be a railway in this area of the country for many years to come. We want to leave a legacy of understanding of what archaeology was in this area. We want to leave a legacy of good archives, finds in the museums. We want to develop new techniques to deliver the gold standard of archaeology that I've been talking about, and to inspire the next generation of archaeologists, to make sure that people are interested and inspired to keep learning more about their past, and to learn more about the local area, and to tell the stories of this local area that we go through. So what are the stories of this local area? What are we trying to find out? What research questions have we set out? Well, we set out about 23, well, exactly 23 separate research questions that we want to identify through our works, and they really cover every period in history, which is kind of a testament to the fascinating landscape that we run through in the Northwest here. So just let's start way back when. Question number 2 is very interesting. We're very interested in the last ice age, and we're specifically concerned with how this area was impacted by the last ice age. We know that during the last ice age we had glaciers and sheets of ice extending down to the 2A route, and we have the opportunity to try and identify how far. And that's hugely important, because obviously glaciers in the landscape will change how people settled, but also the tills, the types of geology that are laid down by these glaciers, also have the potential to seal in very early evidence of the landscapes of North Staffordshire and Cheshire. And we can start to get a picture of the environment and the landscape and the climate and everything that formed people's experiences in the very deep past. This is a really interesting area. We know that the glaciers extended down into the 2A route, but being able to provide a little bit more visibility on that is something that only the kind of linear program that we're proposing can do, because it's a line, and we can provide we can take samples and do work at various points along that line to really drill down and provide a lot of precision to this important question. So if we move forward through history a little bit more, question number 7 is about prehistory. We can see, and I'll show you a little bit later, that the Trent Valley, which is the southern area of our route, was really, really important in both early and slightly later prehistory. And by that, I'm talking about something called, well, the Neolithic, which is when we start to see the earliest farms, through to the Bronze Age and Iron Age, when we see more complex societies. And HS2 is giving us the opportunity to investigate that, because we can see from the crop marks, and I'll show you some photos a little later, that this is a very densely settled area, and the opportunity to identify how long people have been settling there, how these places interfaced with each other, is going to be a really key question, a really key driver of the work that we want to do. We also have some very sort of technical questions. Question number 12 is a little bit different. It challenges us to find the kind of subtle sites that we wouldn't normally potentially wouldn't be able to pick up, and this ties into our desire to do good work, good archaeological practice. We know from previous work in this area that a lot of settlement sites, particularly in Cheshire, actually tend to have very low levels of what you might think of as traditional archaeological finds, sort of stone, metal and ceramics. Instead, it's possible they use higher amounts of organic material, of wood, of animal bone and antler, and of course these don't survive quite as well as, say, metalwork, and that makes our job more challenging. It's a difficult question, but it's one we're keen to grapple with, and we do that by examining how we do archaeology from the very beginning. We're paying particular attention to isolated finds in the topsoil. We're using different scanning machinery, different kinds of geophys, to try and provide a higher resolution, to try and identify these sort of ephemeral, to use that word again, sites. But of course, we're also more interested in the most recent past. This section of HS2, Phase 2A, runs into Crewe, and the importance of the railway to the history of Crewe can't really be overstated. We run in along the West Coast Main Line, and anything we might be able to contribute to the understanding the history and the development and the construction of the railways is going to be similarly important. It's an important question, and question 20 on our list challenges us to investigate this railway heritage, and really we come bang up to date as well, and this kind of ties into our desire to involve people. We're interested in the wartime heritage of this area. We know, for example, that the Trent and the Trent and Mersey Canal were fortified in case of invasion during the Second World War, and we have at least one World War II pillbox falling within the line of HS2. We know there was a Royal Ordnance factory near Swinnerton. We have other wartime features and potentially even Cold War features within our within the area of HS2, and this is something that happened within living memory. You know, there is the possibility that people may know or have relations that are involved in these features. So this takes us really bang up to date, and we really are interested in everything from the deepest ice age up to yesterday. Effectively, archaeology starts yesterday. So that's kind of an introduction to what we wanted to find out. So I think it's probably worth just showing a little bit of detail about the 2A route to explore where we're going to be excavating and where we're going to be finding these, where we're going to be trying to answer these features. So there's a lot of ways to look at a landscape, and even more ways to try and understand how people moved and developed and thrived through it during history. But one way that we're approaching it on Phase 2A is to look at the topography we're passing through. So look at the shape of the landscape, to look at the geology and how that defines and shapes the archaeology that we're expecting. So to orientate you a little bit on this map, this shows North Staffordshire and East Cheshire. This is the line of 2A, as you'd expect. The dark blue in the centre is HS2. That is what the railway is going to look like during the construction period, from the top down. And obviously you can see how complex it is. Building a railway is not just a case of drawing a straight line from A to B. It's a complex engineering project, and you can see how that blue line moves between the greens and the reds of the background map. And these greens and reds show the height of the land. They show how the landscape changes. They show the steepness of the slopes, and they show the kind of gentle versus steeper landscapes that we move through. And straight away you can immediately see that, certainly for one interpretation from the way we're looking at it at this point, is there are 3 zones here. We've divided the route into 3 areas. In the south, that blue area, we've got the Trent Valley, the central area, which is circulated in pink there. We've got a kind of more upland area. We can see a bit more red, a bit more darker colours, indicative of a slightly steeper, slightly more upland landscape. And then at the very top, we've got a green area, a very flat area. This is called the Cheshire Plain, and we've ringed that in green. And all 3 of these areas have very different characters, and those characters will shape the archaeology that we're expecting over the next few years. So let's focus on the southern area at the bottom of the screen, which we've ringed in this light blue. You can see it's predominantly green, a little bit of yellow. You can see that the course of the railway weaves between these red areas. This is the Trent Valley, and as we move on to the next slide, we can see kind of what we're expecting in that Trent Valley. This is an area that's obviously defined by the River Trent. Rivers are important throughout human history, and it sounds trite, but people love living next to rivers, and people always have, for very good reasons. There are obvious reasons: fresh water, transport, fishing, other resources, but there are also more subtle reasons. The action of a river, and the course of rivers changes and meanders throughout history, but the action of this churns and alters the landscape to leave a lighter soil, a more free draining soil, and this is the most suitable kind of landscape for early farming. When you're trying to farm using bone and antler tools rather than tractors, this makes for a very attractive proposition. You want this kind of lighter landscape, and because of these factors, this is an area we're expecting our most complex, concentrated settlement. This is where people began settling in the later Stone Age and continued right through prehistory, and this is an area where we think we've got the very deepest history of settlement and the most complex archaeology. I'll show you in a second some of the crop marks, which I'll explain about as well, but really this area, particularly between Fradley and just to the north of Fradley, contains a higher concentration of what we're calling recognised archaeology than any other portion of the 2A route. It's a particularly intensive area, and we think we can see a lot of funerary monuments and ritual enclosures, a lot of interesting stuff. There's been some great work on the River Tame, not far away, which has discovered large-scale ritual complexes, and we're very, very interested in how the area of North Staffordshire will feed into that. We also have a possible square barrow in this area, which is fascinating. I did my training in York on the east, in the east of England, and that area we find a lot of square barrows, particularly a site called Garton Slack, where we find hundreds of them. But they're much less well understood in this area. So this is an opportunity to really understand something that's quite unusual and quite unique, and something we can really feed again to this national question: why do we find so many in the east? Why have we got this example in the west? And what can we tell, and what can we share about that? We have these extensive crop marks, but of course, I'm talking a lot here about prehistory and about the early stuff, but Staffordshire is famous for its large manorial estates. The wealth of the place in the post-medieval period led to a lot of large-scale emparkment and very clever, beautiful designed landscapes. We have evidence of Capability Brown, a very famous landscape architect who influenced several of the parks in this area. Shugborough, which is outside of our route, but is a very important park in its own right. The home of Admiral Anson, a 18th century ship's captain. It's a beautiful designed landscape, and it's really an exceptional example of what Staffordshire is famous for in the post-medieval period. And of course, then we have the industrial side of things as well. This is an area, this southern area is where the Trent and Mersey Canal runs. We have evidence of extractive industries, and certainly our documentary on Phase One talks so much about the Industrial Revolution and the people that lived in Birmingham and London during the Industrial Revolution. But North Staffordshire and Staffordshire in general and this whole area were areas where the resources that fueled that Industrial Revolution were originating. So we really are feeding into a broad national picture and some incredible important work about our nation's history. So when we move further north on the route, we can come to this middle portion of the route that's flagged in pink. That's the kind of more upland area. This is higher ground that's extending south from the Peak District, and you can see from the map that the route crosses much more undulating terrain. It's an area that moves up and down much more sharply, and that has implications for what we're looking for, because when we move on to the next slide, we see that we're actually looking at different things here. This is an area of heavier geology. This is a place where we have something called mudstone. It's more difficult to farm, and our evidence here seems to suggest more dispersed, less intensive settlement. There's evidence for medieval woodland clearance, and extensive woodland and forestry in this area would again shape how people settled and what techniques we use. But also in this area we have some fantastic deserted medieval villages. These are settlements that fell out of use around 700 years ago, and the remains of them lie within the route of HS2. They could have fallen out of use for a variety of factors. The easy answer is often plague or the Black Death, but it's rarely that simple, and that's actually a rare reason. It tends to be economic factors, people moving away, changing industries. But to have these complete medieval settlements to explore is going to provide us with a really amazing cross-section of how people lived in the medieval period. And of course we have Hopton Battlefield just to the north of HS2. This was the site of a Civil War skirmish between Parliament and the Royalists. It's one of those rare battles where both sides claim victory, but our route avoids the battle itself. But we'll certainly be thinking about what might have overshot. Cannonballs, of course, don't stop at the edge of maps. So we'll be looking into this area particularly closely. And then, of course, we have the World War II heritage, which I touched on a little bit earlier. The most northern area of our route, just going back to our map again, is a much flatter landscape. This is the Cheshire Plain. This is flagged in green at the top of the map there, and that's an area of very flat land, and we think flattened by this sort of glacial action that I mentioned earlier. And when we move to the next slide, we can see that it's very different again. There is much more limited evidence of this kind of prehistoric activity I've been talking about. But we know there are flint outcrops. Flint is very important, of course. We know there's potential for salt. We know that there are resources that are really desirable for these kind of early societies. But it's obviously presenting very differently to the work further south I've talked about. You can see it less clearly in the landscape. This might mean that the settlement patterns were very different. It might mean that the geology and the landscape through which they existed was very different, and we're very, very interested to find out more about that. And of course, we have railway heritage. Crewe Station is a Grade 2 listed building, and we have the West Coast Main Line, as I mentioned. So our approach in this area is going to be different again. So we've talked a little bit about the research question of the landscape, but how are we going to find this amazing archaeology? Well, we are working through a process. You know, there are a broad array of techniques that we're going to be applying to HS2's landscape, and we're going to be carrying out a huge amount of research even before we put a spade in the ground, so to speak. So just taking a few of these as examples. We've done a huge amount of work with historic maps. We have a great historic map resource dating back to the 17th century, and those are useful for two reasons. Not only do they show how the landscape looked, not only do they show the layout of buildings and towns and farms, but there's more subtle clues as well. Field names are very, very interesting. Names of fields like Blackgrounds or Black Earth can indicate that there was a settlement there. Burr, Bury, field names like that are often old words for fortification. So if we see a Bury field, a Burr field, then straight away our archaeological ears prick up and we start to look at that area a little more closely. Desk-based sources beyond maps, of course. I talked about Hopton Battlefield. Phase One has done some great work at Lichfield with looking at some of the Civil War records around there. The siege of Lichfield was a complex undertaking. I've worked on some of the Phase One sites in Area Central around Burnwood Forest, where there was actually a translation of a Saxon charter from the 900s, which you can actually you can still see some of the elements that are mentioned there in the landscape, which is a real thrill. We have high-tech approaches. LiDAR, light imaging, light detection and ranging is a way of looking very, very closely at the shape of the land, and that can give us hints about what's there. It can show us, crucially from our point of view, it can cut through trees. Not literally, I would add, it can show us what's underneath the tree cover without actually affecting any of the trees, so that's a real plus. We have aerial photography. I mentioned that earlier. When people cut ditches, when people cut foundations, when people build their houses, when those fill back in, the earth is different. It's less compacted, it drains better, crops grow differently on it, so that we can see from the air whether those crops are a little bit drier, a little bit taller. We can see the evidence of previous archaeological, we can show the evidence of archaeological sites in those locations from the air. We have geophysics. This is an option. This is a technique you may have seen on Time Team and similar programs, where our specialists walk across the sites with handheld equipment that allows them to detect the levels of the differential levels of magnetism in some of these foundations and footings and drains and cut features. And this really gives us good visibility of sites without having to do the kind of intrusive work that you can see in the bottom right. But of course, that intrusive work, that trial trenching, is a very key part of our process. Nothing will give you as good an answer as opening up the ground and looking and seeing what's there. But obviously it's complex, it's expensive. But you know, if you see this kind of thing going on in your local area in Staffordshire and East Cheshire, you'll know that this is archaeological work ongoing. So let's look at this in practice on one of our sites on the 2A route. We're at a point where we are working through that process that I've just outlined, but we're getting towards the right-hand side of that process. We've carried out a good amount of desk-based work, and we've done a little bit of non-intrusive work as well. So this example here on the left-hand side, you can see what we're showing from aerial photographs. The left-hand map there, everything in red there, we think is a potential archaeological feature. So let's work through what we're looking at, because it's complex and it's interesting. There's kind of highlighted with a blue arrow there, that 90-degree angle of dots. Our first thought was that might be a pit alignment, which is a kind of Bronze Age feature, the way that landscape might have been divided 4,000 years ago, kind of sort of formed of a long line of shallow pits stretching across the landscape. There are all sorts of interesting questions about their function, how they were built, the symbolism of them. And this could be a real interesting opportunity. You can see later features there highlighted in pink and orange arrows. And we're very interested in the phasing of this site, how these features fit together, which ones came first, which of these could be seen in the area by the other features. So straight away, as soon as we saw from the air this kind of level of information, we wanted to carry out survey work. And in the centre there, you can see our first pass at survey, this magnetometry survey. This picks up the differential magnetism. It's confirmed that two of those features are visible there that I've highlighted in orange and blue. The pit alignment looks a little bit different, and we might have to revise that interpretation. It just shows the process in action. We can also use even more high-tech techniques. On the right-hand side there, you can see ground-penetrating radar, which is a very clever technique that allows us to get an idea of depth, crucially, which as archaeologists is always going to be supremely interesting. We know that there's this real concentration of ritual monuments in this area. We know there is a real concentration in this single field, which is just incredible. So it illustrates what's so interesting about this kind of dense archaeology. We need to know what came first, which element is earliest, how did these people view traces of the past, and how did these people view the archaeology almost that they could see around them. So that's what we've got at this earlier stage, but then we also, of course, have what we physically find in the field. So if we move on to the next slide, we can see some of our initial results, and when we got into these areas, we begin to find from field walking, which is simply our specialists walking across the field, flint. We can see the napped flint in the bottom there. You can see some of the marks of people carving this flint to shape, and that's I find that very interesting, and almost, you know, this is a real tangible connection. You're holding something in your hand that someone worked on, someone had in their hand many thousands of years ago. And it provides that kind of very direct link and confirms the evidence that we have from these kind of proxy and survey techniques that I showed you a second ago. It shows you the link and the physical, tangible aspect of what we thought was there, which is both reassuring and fascinating. And when we get on to do intrusive work, potentially, if we receive consent for this project, then I have no doubt that we'll continue to find these kind of fascinating and interesting materials. And I think I'll just show one other early find that we found on the next slide, because it's so interesting, really. This came out as part of our program of organised metal detecting, and this is a canal token. This dates from 1792. From the 18th century, you can just about on there make out the words 1779 span 100 feet, which is the date of the bridge that's portrayed on that photo, on that token, rather than the token itself. Very interesting piece of industrial heritage relating to the Ketley Canal, which is about 20 miles to the south. This was a way that companies used to pay their workers in sort of almost company scrip. So it was a way of, it's never proved particularly popular, as I'm sure you can imagine why. I certainly would much prefer real money, but it shows the interesting industrial heritage that we have in this area from the very earliest stages of our project. This is from the Ketley Canal, as I said, about 20 miles to the south, and I think that that really illustrates the point that I've been trying to make throughout. The archaeology within the HS2 route forms part of a broad, ever-changing landscape. We HS2 don't go closer than 20 miles to the Ketley Canal, but we still find evidence of it within our land, within the route of HS2, and it shows the importance. And it comes back, I think, to the quote that Historic England showed. Again, just circling back to that, it shows that we are part of this broader archaeological landscape, and I certainly hope we'll be able to provide more information, more intelligence, and really share this story. So I think I'll leave it there. That's a brief introduction, but I'll pass it back over to Emma in case you have questions or if I can help in any other way.
Great. Thank you, Chris. So there is a slight delay, so we will just give it a couple of minutes for if anyone has any questions. We'd like to welcome those now so I can ask Chris. While we're just waiting for that, I'll just also tell you that tomorrow is the last day of our Heritage Open Day webinars, and we have a conference going live tomorrow with various talks from our contractors if you've been interested in any of the talks that we've had on this week. Everybody's quite quiet, Chris. You stun them. Okay, well, if we don't have, have we got any? Okay, we have a couple of questions come through. So we have one saying, this is a really interesting briefing as someone who lives in Crewe and has worked for HS2 for 2 years prior to joining Network Rail. They missed the first 15 minutes due to technical problems. Where will the findings be held for future viewings?
Sure. So, so two questions. This presentation will be on our YouTube channel. I think I'm right in saying, Emma. Mm-hmm. Yes. But in terms of the finds, that's a very good question. So, as I said, sort of part of the presentation, which you may have missed, as we are obliged to publish and share our findings, and in due course, the specific finds and the things that I've shown you will be deposited in a museum. HS2 is obviously a vast and complicated project, so how that will look is something that we're working very intently on. This is standard archaeological practice. Obviously, we need to hold on to the finds for a little while to make sure that we're assessing them, to make sure that we're analysing them, to make sure that we are gaining as much knowledge and really letting our specialists investigate them as fully as we can. But when that process is over, when we've drawn together an archive, when we've tidied up effectively and labelled and recorded everything, then that will all be deposited in a museum and made available to the public as required.
That's great, thanks, Chris. So I guess to follow on from that, we have some sort of similar questions as well. How can people keep in touch with progress of the finds?
I think our Commonplace website is the best option there. HS2 runs a Commonplace website online, and we're very, very keen, and we will be providing archaeological input to that, providing archaeological updates, and when we get into the field, which I certainly hope we do, we'll be able to provide a little bit more detail, a little bit more concrete evidence of what we're finding, which is going to be hugely exciting. At the moment, like I say, we have sniffs of things, we have these surveys, we have these tantalising hints of what's going to be there, but when we begin to investigate and we begin our trial trenching programme, I think we'll have some really useful and interesting things to put on these Commonplace sites. That's great.
We also have a question to see if people would be allowed to attend any of the digs.
It's a very good question. It's a very interesting question. Obviously, at the moment, COVID is kind of putting a bit of a scup on that, and we take our safety responsibilities very seriously, and that kind of filters through into more usual construction. archaeology is a construction discipline. It is a serious construction process, and we take our safety responsibilities very, very seriously at HS2. It is our highest priority. So we are always looking for ways to engage people with the project. We're always happy to come and give talks. We're always happy to engage with the discussion. It's going to have to be as and when basis, I think, with some of these. We have run open days on phase one. We haven't recently for obvious COVID reasons. We will be investigating this on phase 2, but I'm afraid I can't commit to anything in terms of site access at this point for those reasons I've outlined. We are keen to engage, but it is more complicated perhaps than it sounds. I
think we'll be looking as to some virtual site visits as well, and things like that we're exploring on phase 1. Just seeing if there's any more linked to that. So will there be a Friends of the Archaeologists groups, so local people along the route can also get involved? I think that's sort of kind of answered that one. Oh, hang on, we've got one more. So what is the Madeley Paleo Lake you mentioned on the slide?
Oh, well, Emma, actually, this is almost your one of mine. Emma's a doctor in your doctorate's in the very area, isn't it? I think it's a feature. It's a lake that existed much earlier in prehistory. It has the potential to seal in deposits that might allow us to understand the environment in the past. And we're not just interested in people's traces, the evidence that people leave in the past. We're also interested in the environment that they lived in, and these sort of historic lakes that are no longer exist still have that potential to seal in some of the organic material and the paleo-environmental evidence that allows us to reconstruct those environments that existed in the past. And when we think about the history and archaeology, that climate actually has a huge impact. We know about there are sort of common phrases that exist in archaeology, like the Roman warm period, like the post-Roman cool period, and these are phrases that represent something more fundamental, which is the way that the environment shaped human history. And these places like these paleo lakes at Madeley have the potential to seal in very direct evidence and proxies to help us understand that landscape. I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that, Emma. With your
expertise. You summed that up perfectly. That was great. Okay, I think that's all, mainly all we have got. Yeah, that's all of our questions summed up now. So that's your bang on 2 o'clock. So if you would like to know more about HS2 in your area, you can also check our local area websites. There is a feedback link in the chat box, and we would also really appreciate your feedback on this webinar. So thank you all for attending. Thank you, Chris, and hope you all have a lovely weekend.